So now that we've talked about what a future is, I'm going to give you an overview of the life cycle of a future and also talk about some common known uses from everyday life. We refer to these as human known uses in patterns literature. So we'll first start by talking about the life cycle of a future, and then I'll present to you a couple of interesting human known uses of the future pattern. So let's start by talking about the life cycle of a future. If you recall our discussion before, a future is a proxy that represents the result of an asynchronous call. And so what it does is it gives you this virtual data object that the client thread, the caller, can either use to block or not block when it tries to get the contents of the computation before they finish running in the background. And we'll talk through this diagram. Basically, what's happening here is that a computation is invoked, typically using the active object pattern. The caller gets back a future, and then the computation runs in a service thread in the background, and then the client can decide how to get the results. And we'll talk about several different means of doing that in a moment. Here's an example that outlines the typical life cycle of a future. And this, of course, is from our upcoming EX16 case study that we'll be talking about throughout the next series of parts of these lessons. So the client starts by creating the active object. So the client thread running in one thread, typically the main thread, or could be some other thread, creates an active object and starts it. The active object then returns back to the client. So the client thread has a future that it can use to manage the life cycle of that computation. And then the computation will run in the background, in a background thread, asynchronously with respect to the calling thread. So the calling thread sets the wheels in motion. The computation is running in the background. The client thread can go off and do other stuff if it wants to. There's no need for it to block immediately waiting for the results. At some point, the client is going to want the results. And so it's got a couple of different choices. We'll talk to those choices here in just a moment. But essentially, the client can use the future to obtain the results of the asynchronous computation once it's complete. So that's the typical life cycle of a future. You start a computation, you get a future, and then at some point, you go to get the results of that future. Well, it turns out that there's a really nice couple of human known uses of this pattern that we're probably all familiar with from our daily lives. And some examples that I'm familiar with in this context are restaurant table tent numbers, order receipts, receipts that have an order number on them, and table number stands. These are all things you've probably run across if you go to fast food restaurants or if you go to a deli where you're going to place your order and then you get one of these little futures, and then they use that to get you connected to your order later once your food is ready. To explore this, we're going to compare and contrast the old school way that McDonald's used to make their food and serve it to people versus the Wendy's way of doing fast food preparation, because they provide a nice model and metaphor for these different approaches. So back in the day, this goes back a ways, McDonald's historically performed synchronous transactions. You would walk up to the cash register, you would place your order, you'd want some fries and a Big Mac and a diet soda or a Diet Coke or whatever, and you would then wait synchronously at that cash register. And the clerk who was serving you would often turn around and reach back into a cache of food that was kept warm with a heat lamp. So you might have a cache of fries, you might have a cache of Big Macs, you might have a cache of pre-poured sodas and so on. And those would then be handed to you. So your interaction with the server was synchronous. And the problem, of course, there is you can end up with a long line of people waiting to be served. And not everybody's order is going to take the same amount of time. But if you're waiting in line, then you've got what's often called head of line blocking. So if the person ahead of you has a long order and you have a short order, you've got to wait for their long order to be satisfied. In contrast, Wendy's way of doing things was to perform asynchronous transactions using futures. In other words, you would place your order, they would give you a receipt with a number on it, or a table tent number, or a table number stand, or whatever it was back in the day. And that way, you didn't have to block after you placed the order. You would get the order placed, they would often give you a cup, you would go fill your own drink, and then at some point, your food, which had been cooked to ordered, would be delivered to you. And there were typically two ways of redeeming your future. You could either go back periodically to the pickup window and say, hey, is my food ready for order number 42? And if so, they'd hand it to you. And if the food wasn't ready, you could either wait by the pickup counter or you could walk back to whatever you were doing at your seat and read a newspaper or talk to your friends or browse the internet and so on and so forth. There are different ways to get your food. The other way to do it was they would come out and deliver it to your table. So that's kind of a callback model, whereas the first model I talked about where you go and check at the pickup window is sort of a polling model. Well, those were historically the two ways of doing this. Nowadays, most restaurants, for a variety of reasons, have moved to a non-blocking, future-based model. So even at McDonald's, usually when you go in now, you place your order, they'll give you a little piece of paper with a number on it, and you go off and do other stuff and they bring your food to you or they deliver it and so on when it's done. But the key point there is that we are all familiar with this concept of futures in environments where you have asynchronous interactions with servers, or in this case, cashiers or clerks, who are going to cook your food after you have left where you're going to be placing the original transaction. So that's the end of a quick overview of the life cycle of a future, as well as some common human known uses from everyday life.